Hi. We're going to be talking about Chapter 8 today, which I'll try and keep it as brief and to the point as possible. There's a couple of different topics that Chapter 8 deals with. First of all is the concept of fossils, what they are, what we're dealing with. This is the raw information that paleoanthropologists, physical anthropologists, archaeologists have to deal with in terms of human evolution. So far in this class we've been looking at the concepts of what evolution is, of the basic theories of evolution, and what science is, and how to approach what humans are from the perspective of just simply a biological creature. We saw that microevolution is the way that we can look at evolution taking place in real time that we can observe. And the principle of uniformitarianism shows us that we can actually extrapolate from this microevolutionary concept into a macroevolutionary one, which allows us to go back in time to see how evolution took place at earlier times that we can't directly be surrounded by. Now that means that we've got to involve a great number of different scientific disciplines, because it's not just about evolution isn't just about an emerging biological form. It's not just your bones changing. It's about adaptation to particular environmental forces and stresses. So that's some of the basic principles that we've been looking at in the previous chapters, how that takes place. Something like the video that we saw of the Thai forest in Africa. We saw 15, 20, 30 different species of primates living all on top of one another at the same time, feeding off of slightly different things, different adaptations to accessing different food sources, and having slightly different body types as a consequence. So even amongst primates you can have variation, but importantly this varies through it doesn't just vary through time, it also varies at the same time. So that sort of relationship between the fossils that we're going to look at, the actual evidence for the remains from the past, we have to then put into a context. Where were these creatures living? What were they doing? How were they surviving? What were they feeding on? What were their behaviors like? Now these are all very tricky questions that a dead fossil can't really tell us directly, but we have to take the bits and pieces and make the most out of them as best as we can. So this chapter 8, we talk about what fossils are, what they aren't, and also what they can do and what they cannot do for us. And then we have to think about, where do we find fossils? What does that tell us? Not just what they look like and what their forms tell us about their adaptations, but also the context in which they're found, how old they are. Was this a forest or a savanna? Was it what was the other food that was available? And how does this relate to the adaptations that we see in their physiology? So we were seeing this in a sort of a present day sense. And what we want to do is we want to turn these evolutionary principles to the past to try and understand how the fossils that we see in the archaeological record relate to adaptations. This will tell us then about the processes that led to the rise of certain features. And of course, like physical anthropology, we're interested in us. We're interested in humans. So we want to find our line. We could do a course on the evolution of zebras and where they come from, and we could go to the first Eohippus, the earliest horse, and see how they developed and speciated into different branches of horse and equids. But we're interested in humans, so what we want to do is look at primates. And so after Chapter 8, we're going to look at the emergence of primates, where they start, and how they develop, where they develop, why they develop the way they do. And that will tell us about the fundamentals of our group of animals. That starts at the order. We could go take it back further, but for the purposes of this course, starting at primates is a pretty sensible place. So on the second slide, if you switch to the second slide, you will see that a bunch of people scrambling around looking at the ground. You'll see people staring at the ground, picking through, turning over rocks, kicking things with their feet. I'm looking at this right now. And you see that this is all on the surface. Well, they're looking for fossils. And you might ask yourself, okay, what are fossils doing on the surface? Well, this is a particular spot that I'm going to refer to time and again as hotspots. What I mean by that is there are certain places where fossils occur more regularly and more reliably than other places. And to understand where these places are, we have to understand geology a little bit. It would be great if we could just know where the fossils were all the time and go straight to them, but that's not really possible. The understanding what fossils are, what they are, tells us where they might appear. Now, fossils, unlike what they might look like in a museum or mounted in someplace, they're not bones. They're nothing living. They were once living things, but they have transformed. The normal thing that you would expect of a living creature is that decomposition and decay takes place. And that's what happens most of the time. That is what we've come to expect. That is what happens. Under very rare circumstances, however, when certain conditions take place whereby the process of decay slows down for long enough that the surrounding soil that covers these remains, and this can be human remains or human ancestor remains or even plant or animal remains of any kind, really. If they sit in a particular type of soil for long enough, under certain conditions, the organic elements that are in constitute bones in particular will leach out, and they will be replaced by inorganic minerals, things like silicates. In other words, this is transforming living tissue into stone. It is petrifying the once living remains. Now, as you can imagine, then all of the things like DNA, amino acids, stable isotopes, all of these things are going to be gone. So there's little you can do with a fossil other than look at it and try and understand what that physiology is like from its appearance. So there's no chemical analyses you can do. Now, thankfully, it's not an all or none situation. You have, when you come closer in time to us, and the closer you get past 100,000 years or so, this mineralization takes place in sort of stages or in incrementally. It's not, and so there, for things like Neanderthals, we have been able to recover some organic elements of the Neanderthal remains, and we've actually been able to retrieve DNA. That's recent enough in time that it is not fully mineralized, not fully fossilized, not fully petrified, where these bones are still bones. And but if you go back 1,000,000 years, there's nothing that will survive unless it is fully transformed. It will be completely decayed. So once again, getting back to this picture of people scrambling around on this surface looking for fossils, why would these things be on the surface? Well, we're going to look in the second half of this chapter on the process of how we date things and the principle of stratigraphy, that things that are more deeply buried are older, and things that are on the surface are the latest. Obviously, we're standing on a surface. That is the latest thing. Where my feet are is contemporary surface. That's modern. But when you think about something like the Grand Canyon, that built up through many, many years to become a flat plain until a river started to wash across it and cut down into it. And so what was once very deeply buried deposits you can now see because the canyon has been cut back down through that. So geology is a very dynamic process of building up, taking down, redistributing, moving here, moving there, turning over, and understanding geology helps us to understand what fossils are, where you can expect to find them, and what date they are. So these people that you see fishing through are in a gorge. They're not just on a flat plain. This is a process whereby the ancient deposits have been eroded away, and they can actually jump down into this ravine, into this gorge, and they can see on the surface the ancient deposits spilling out of previously stratified deposits. I should also point out that there was a time when we only had one fossil, and this one fossil, in the principles of evolution and theory, was our ancestor, as far as we knew. And then we had two fossils, and both of those were our relatives, and we could say one is older than the other. And with the principle of evolution, we could think that there is some common ancestor to chimpanzees and bonobos that we share that goes back about 10 million years or so. And so these fossil ancestors of ours fit in between that common ancestor and us. But as we get more and more fossils, we see that the picture is more complicated than just every fossil that we find is our ancestor. If you think again to this forest in Africa that we saw in the video, there were multiple species of primates living side by side with one another at the same time. And as we've gotten more and more fossils, we realize that the picture of the past is as complicated as it is in the present, as you might actually reasonably expect anyway. So the fossils that we get sometimes overlap with one another in time, in space. And that means that not all of these fossils that we find are our ancestors. They can be our competitors. They may can't come, in fact, from the same common ancestor that we have from with chimpanzees and bonobos, but they split off and went in a different direction and overlapped with us. So now there are 60,000 specimens of fossils from a place like Kenya alone. Just on its own, Kenya has 60,000 fossils. So what was once 1, 2, 3, 4 fossils that only fit into a very neat picture of the past, we now see as more of a bush that's spreading out from a common ancestor and is actually a lot of different adaptive strategies. That's why finding out the times and the adaptations, the sequence and the locations, all of these things add to our picture to try and put us into that line. We want to find our line and see how we relate to our competitors in the past. And so for this reason, changing to slide 3, finding fossils in their place in time and nature is the most important thing. And because fossils are not actual bones, all we have to do is be able to look at them. They're like casts of bones. And so understanding physiology and the way that physiology works is extremely important. And specialists spend a lot of time understanding the way bones fit together, their orientation, but also the way that things like muscles attach. What kind of environment they would have been in tells us what their, for instance, pigmentation would have been like, or how much hair they would have had on their bodies. And knowing if they were in a forest or in a savanna environment, grasslands, we can talk a little bit about their diet and see how there are changes in their faces, their teeth, their body types, whether they were standing or whether they were had grasping feet or specially adapted feet for being bipedal. All of these things build up a picture of this development, and we're trying to find those developments that led to us as humans and the context in which that happened. Slide 4. tells us a little bit about the history of our knowledge of fossils. Actually, the knowledge of fossils goes all the way back to classical times. The Greeks and the Romans were writing about this. So this is nothing new. We've known about them. But it wasn't really until the Enlightenment thinkers started to be able to talk about gradualism, change through time, uniformitarianism, these things that the church had once not allowed. People like William Smith started to actually make observations in the 18th century that different types of rock that he found on the island of Britain dated to different time periods. And in each of those different rock formations that dated to different time periods had different sets of fossils. And some of them didn't exist anymore. Things like a giant ground sloth. Those don't exist anymore. So what happened to them? This concept of extinction or of transformation through evolution started to culminate in Darwin's thought. And Darwin was actually well aware of fossils when he set off on his voyage of the Beagle around the world. This principle that William Smith came up with was the principle of faunal succession, that if you can have a sequence of geological strata that have fossils found in them, you can actually, by inference, see a sequence of fossils and how they develop. And so the geology tells us what time we're talking about, and the fossils tell us what biology was living at that time. And this doesn't have to be neatly stratified, and the map that you see is actually a hodgepodge of colors. And that's because, as I mentioned before, geology is a dynamic thing, that you have things building up, you have things that are being eroded away, you have things that are being redistributed, you have things that are being created. There are three types of geology, or three types of rock, I should say, in geology. That is to say, there's igneous, which is made through volcanic or magmatic conditions. So in other words, intense heat that liquefies rock. You have metamorphic, which is primarily through intense pressure, transforms one type of rock into another through geological pressure, very, very intense pressure. And then you have sedimentary. And sedimentary rock is, as the name implies, involves sediments being formed. And so a river, a lake, a sea drop sediments down. Air can also move sediments around. Dust or that sort of thing, aeolian deposits, will create layers and beds in usually horizontal, flat deposits. The fossils, for fossils to form, as you might expect, a fossil is not going to form in igneous conditions. It will liquefy whatever it touches, and so any living remains of a living creature are going to be completely annihilated in igneous rock. Also, in metamorphic rock, the pressures are so great that it would pulverize any remains into nothing. And so you won't find fossils in metamorphic rocks either. What you do find is occasionally, rarely, but the only place that you find fossils forming are in sedimentary conditions. And this is where the process of decomposition is slowed down fast enough, often by things like a layer of silt covering, or mud, or volcanic ash covering deposits, stopping that process of decay, and then the process of leaching out those organic compounds and replacing them with mineral compounds is the process of fossilization. So for a physical anthropologist to go and look for fossils, the only place you're going to find them is sedimentary rocks. That's, in principle, a third of the rocks on the Earth. So 2/3 of the places you can just write off, we're not going to find them there. Also, because sedimentary deposits can be buried so deeply, kilometers deep, miles deep even, that the it's impractical for a physical anthropologist to just take a guess and start digging down for a kilometer. That's just too deep, and there's not enough money in the world for that kind of a risk. So what we do is we find maps like you see here on slide 4 that show that actually the dynamic processes of geology have exposed some earlier strata side by side other ones. Also, you have these things like the Grand Canyon. In Africa, the African Grand Canyon is called the Great Rift Valley, which runs up the eastern side of the continent, and it is exposed layer after layer after layer of stratified sedimentary deposits that we've found fossils in. And so this is naturally a hotspot that people keep going back to because we know that A, fossils have formed there and we're likely to find them again, and B, that they're relatively easy to get to because you can just jump into this big gorge and see them on the side, eroding out of the canyon wall. So slide 5, you can see this principle of faunal succession. If you go back to geological deposits that are 3.5 billion years old, what would you expect to find? Well, we saw this already in our earlier chapters, that the earliest forms of life were single-celled organisms, prokaryotes. And so you can see on this slide if you go back to those early rocks, you can actually find fossilized bacteria that are billions of years old. And then you see eukaryotes emerging. That's how we know this. We actually have the fossil evidence for these things emerging. And then you have multicellular life, but it's simple and sea-based, and so you have these microscopic or very tiny sea creatures like this shell that you see. And in fact, all limestone, almost all limestone, was formed in the Cretaceous period with a mass extinction of sea life, and all of these little tiny sea creatures sank to the bottom, created these strata of layers of shells that then fossilized and solidified into what we now call limestone. And if next time you come across limestone, take a look very closely at it, and you will probably see little sea creatures and little shell forms in that. We also have forms like the trilobite that you see there, which is long extinct. You also have plant life, like the fern there. It looks similar to ferns we have today, but that's because they were adapting in a similar way to the way that ferns do contemporarily. But there are significant differences. Just because they look like that doesn't mean that they haven't changed. They are just as evolved as any other thing that is living today. We've evolved from them just as much as anything else. So crabs and turtles that you see there, those are also have forms that are very similar to ones that exist today, but those actually that's because they were adapting to similar conditions in the past. You also have extinctions, things like the dinosaurs. They died out, at least as large creatures like that, but some of them adapted and formed into other things. We suspect that birds are all evolved from some dinosaur species. Fish as well, and also mammals like the one on the lower right-hand side of your slide, which is a recently discovered fossil primate called Darwinius, which is one of the earliest fossils ever found, discovered in a 47 million year old swamp in Germany. So the next slide shows the fossilization process as I was describing. You have an organism, say one of our ancestors, that dies on a river or lake bed. They decompose, but that gets interrupted by some sort of an alluvial wash. That traps that time period in a layer. That fossil starts to form in that layer, and that event of that flooding is a time period. And so any information that comes from that is going to be contemporary with the fossil itself. So any pollen or sea creatures or little snails or anything that's in that mud that covers that is going to be the contemporary deposit at the time that the fossilization started. So we can reconstruct environments from all of that information in the past. And then strata build on top of that, and on top of that, and on top of that, and it would be trapped under the earth. Impossible for us to get at unless either we dug it, which it's often so far down that we can't do that, or we go to a place where the earth has actually done the job for us and eroded away some kind of a cliff or canyon. And then we can dig it from the side, come in, and we don't have to do as much work. It saves us time, and it actually is a better way of discovering these things. At the same time, that means that we have a great number of disadvantages that are going on. First of all, fossils are rare. They only occur in one type of rock, and we can't get to those unless it's a situation where we can easily see it. That, of course, then means that we're going to be missing a lot. So there may be a hot spot over here, and there may be a hot spot over here. Was there anything going on in between? Sure. But we just don't have any way to access that information, or the information is entirely gone, and there's no way for us to retrieve it. So the whole process of understanding, the whole concept of understanding the way that remains from the past survive to us in the present is called taphonomy, T-A-P-H-O-N-O-M-Y. Taphonomy. It comes from the Greek, which means the study of the tomb. But forget about that definition of the tomb. It's really about the processes that affect things from the past and their survival into the present. And understanding that tells us what parts we're missing. So, is there going to be any wood? There probably would have been. But that doesn't survive because it's organic, unless it fossilizes. So when we start to get to things like tools, what's going to survive? Stone tools are going to survive, but basketry is not. Shoes are not. Leather is not. Wood is not. So we're missing a lot, but some things do survive, and it's those things that we survive that we can use as positive evidence, but we also have to understand the taphonomic processes well to understand what we are missing and how what we've got has survived. There's some other types of fossil formation. So for instance, on slide 7, you can have disarticulated commingled remains. So you just saw in the previous slide the formation of fossil deposits in a situation where there's a single body that dies on a riverbed and is fossilized altogether. That's great if we can find that, but that's often unrealistic. Those are very, very rare. Those are a subset of fossilization. We usually find fragmentary remains. Just imagine if those bones had gotten washed down that riverbed and disarticulated. You're just going to find one fragment. Likewise, things like predation. So if one of our ancestors gets eaten or scavenged by some predator or scavenger, they're going to mix up those bones. Those are going to wash down into things like a cave, and those caves collect big caches of bones, but they don't all belong to one another. So we have to be able to, and they might not even be from all the same time period. They might have been mixed together, but from relatively close in time. But that's why understanding that stratigraphy and that dating is very important. So we can not necessarily put one creature at the same time with another if they don't date to the same time. Or that's equally important if we find them together in the same moment, in the same stratum, then that means that they're contemporary. Also, it's not just bones that fossilize. On slide 8, we have different types of fossils, like fossilized footprints. These are the famous Laetoli footprints, which would have been put into a mud flat at the time of a volcanic eruption that very quickly covered these, and that became solidified. That mud turned into stone and then eroded away enough that we were able to retrieve these footprints just centimeters below the ground surface, the modern ground surface. But they would have been very deeply buried before. So also we're going to talk a lot about tools, and we're going to talk about other contemporary fossils, and we're going to talk about plants. And so we try and get as much out of this as we can to try and create an entire environment, because evolution isn't, like I said, just about bones changing. They're about the adaptations to environmental stresses that have a particular direction to them. And that's the process that we want to understand if we want to understand why we are the way we are and why we became this way. So fossils have limitations, and some of it is our own. We've only searched for fossils in some places, and so we're lacking in some details. We're going to see some things like Sahelanthropus chidensis, when we come to that, is a particularly informative fossil find because it's not in a hotspot. Somebody went out on a limb and searched in another place, and it actually is a surprising find. But most people do go to these places that other people have been to, and because we can reliably be sure that we will find some sort of details from the past there. And this is because some fossils are preserved in some places and not in others. And so taking a risk is hard to convince funding bodies in academic institutions to go for. And also, we're going to see that these rock sequences aren't just complete. These hotspots aren't just complete sequences from start to finish. We're going to have some hotspots that are good for early primates, so 40 million years to 60 million years ago. Some are going to be for early hominins, so 6 million years ago to 3 million years ago. Some are going to be for hotspots for the emergence of early humans, so from 1 million years ago to 100,000 years ago. So it's not just one place, one hotspot that's going to tell the entire story. We're going to have to switch from one to the other based on where the evidence is found. And when we do find it, and slide 10, understanding it we have to apply the principles that we've already learned. So the principles of evolution and these mechanisms of change, which are natural selection, so we have to put the environment back in there. We understand that mutation is taking place, and that is providing variety that natural selection can work on. But you also have gene flow and genetic drift, and this is what drives speciation. So gene flow, if you don't have speciation occurring, you can assume that there is gene flow taking place. If there is speciation, you can assume that genetic drift is driving these populations into different paths. And so this slide here shows you that you can have one type of a snail with a curly shell, and then some type of some geographical isolation occurs, and a new type of shell emerges. So speciation occurs, and then you have a breakdown of that barrier. You have the one type of shell coming in and taking over, and then you have a replacement. And you will be able to see this buried in the fossil record, where you have what looks like a replacement, but we're trying to interpret the biological, the evolutionary sequence that takes place there. So you have gene flow, you have geographic isolation, you have speciation, and then you have replacement of one species to another. And that is evident in the sequence as we find it. In this example, this is hypothetical, of course. And of course, the bones that we find, or I should say the fossils that we find, aren't bones, but they tell us about not just the living flesh that was on these creatures, but also the behaviors of these creatures. And so we've talked a little bit about how things like the canines of the teeth of primates, they're primarily for your diet. But once you have them, you can use them for behavioral things as well, like impressing females and intimidating males, which can lead to sexual selection, which will increase your likelihood of passing those genes on. So we can see that from the physiological features, we're also trying to interpret behavioral features as well. And this is going to become more important in the subsequent chapters as we start to move more towards us, because we're actually going to try and see how humans became so dependent upon our culture, how our behavioral adaptations became so important to our survival. And this is, of course, very crucial to your essay that I'm asking you to write, which is to look at some of the moments in time when these changes started to take place. So things like tool use and language. When did those occur? And it's up to you to decide what you think is most important. Was it one thing that tipped everything in one direction, and that was set the ball rolling towards culture being an outsized influence on our survival, or is it a gradual process with multi-stages? Or am I completely wrong in even presenting it this way, and that culture and nature are completely the same thing, and we shouldn't separate them, and it's a false dichotomy? Up to you to try and decide. So slide 12 is something you might want to go back to from time to time, because it is a way to sort of look at the entire history of the Earth. It's broken down into time slots, and it's big. Earth has been around for 4.6 billion years, but the earliest life is only about 3.2 or so billion years ago. So the life on Earth you can see starting, and this is broken down into three periods of life: the Paleozoic, which means the old life; the Mesozoic, middle life age; and the Cenozoic, which is the current or recent era of life. And so we're still in the Cenozoic era, and in each of those, that's broken down into subgroups as well. The first primates that we're going to start looking at this are found in the change from the Paleocene to the Eocene, and you can see this all on this chart here, and you can see that this chart actually, it blows up those last three slots into larger forms. So and then that last slot is blown up into an even larger form, and then the last slot is blown up into an even larger form. And so the Cenozoic, or sorry, the Cenozoic is what we're talking about here, but a tiny fragment of that is where we evolved. A very, very small portion of the recent life phase. And most of life was occurring on a single cell life, and then sea life, and it's really only started kicking off in more recent times. And even then, primates didn't start to occur until the Paleocene and Eocene. The anthropoid fossils occur in the Oligocene, ape fossils, which were apes, in the Miocene, and the very first hominins only in the Pliocene. And today, we're only in the most recent, which is about 10,000 years old. We live in what's called the Holocene, although there's a debate as to whether we should have, in 1945, began a new epoch called the Anthropocene, but that's for another time. So, of course, life doesn't evolve in just a linear stair step or ladder type of a sequence. As the environment changes, there are different adaptations that take it into different directions. And so, for a long period of time, for instance, the dinosaurs had a pretty good formula for survival. But things can change. Conditions changed. Some big catastrophes took place. And that actually opened the way for mammals to come through. So you can imagine time as moving in a line, but you should need to you need to be careful with this interpretation, because that sort of makes the assumption that we're the end of this line, and that we are, as humans, the sort of everything is culminating in us. And that's not really true. That's not the way evolution works. We are well adapted to particular conditions, but if those conditions change, we may actually be maladapted to them. This is where we're going to come to this later in later chapters and see where our species is going in the future, because evolution has not stopped on us. We're still evolving. In chapter 14, or sorry, slide 14, what am I saying? Even the Earth itself has not been in the same place as it is today. So in the last 200 million years or so, the continents have started to shift around. What was once in the Paleozoic Pangea, which was all of the continents were squished together in one, plate tectonics tell us that the continents have been separating and pulling apart. They're still moving to this day, and you can see on slide 14 the placement of the continents from the Paleozoic into the current position. But that also has an effect on what kind of life is taking place in these places. So we saw earlier that if there is geographic isolation, you're definitely going to have speciation. And so if primates emerged in a much more closely connected continental landscape, as they pulled apart, you're no longer going to have that gene flow between them, and you're going to have them splitting off in different directions. So the key thing that we need to look for is, where is our line? Where is the development of our species coming from? So you can see that South America is pulling away from Africa, and